I'm WG and let's talk Chizuru versus Sereniel, or even Chizuru plus Sereniel. Once again, apologies that I wasn't able to do this earlier, but for whatever reason, as of this moment, we always get the character kits only a day earlier, meaning that the best I can do is 8 hours before her banner ends. So, let's talk everything Chizuru, everything Sereniel. How does Chizuru perform? What kind of synergies can you expect? How much is Sereniel to be looking forward to? How many Sereniels might you be looking to get? And everything like that. So, first off and the easiest, Itsuku. If at this point you don't have her yet, keep it that way. Itsuku is at most only slightly better than the 3-star partner when it comes to boosting Chizuru's damage. So overall, it is really not that worth it. Another point is Itsuku herself will go not only into the partner rescue, but also will permanently stay in the shop right here. So even if the devs at some point in the future decide to boost or buff other partners like Itsuku with, let's say, season 2, you will always have the opportunity to just buy her here, guaranteed no trouble, meaning you better save yourself your summons. Now on the other hand, what about Peko? So for that, let's quickly go to her kit. Alright, so here we have ourselves Peko. First off, important to note, once the 3-week banner that Peko is on ends, you won't be able to obtain her. While that banner runs, you will be able to buy a copy of her from the shop for 300 points. So that is something you can do. Now, what can she do herself? You get, let's just talk about the base version, right? The E0, A0, whatever, dupe 0, D0, whatever you want to call it. You get 8% attack damage increase, which compared to the next best option is going to be Yuri. Yuri herself gives you a 16% increase as a rare unit, the 3-star partner, and also a 16% damage increase upon you shuffling the deck. The other part here is then when the assigned combatant moves a card from the graveyard to the hand, gain 1 repairs complete. Repairs complete is a battle long buff, and the way you can trigger this is very, very simple with Chizuru, and that is Chizuru herself has these cards called the homing lasers. These homing lasers come to your hand from the graveyard upon you ravaging a target, meaning that so long as you play out 3 homing lasers, you'll then also be able to fully stack this right here, which is going to give you a plus 30% increase to attack cards for the remaining battle, meaning that every single attack card further played by Sereniel is going to do 30% additional damage. Furthermore, you're also going to increase the damage of the combatant's attack cards that are used against ravaged targets by a multiplicative 15%, so that is going to be then a multiplier on top for you attacking ravaged targets, and this is what you could say going to bring her more in line. So overall, the way you can read this is equivalent or slightly better than what a Yuri delivers, and this extra attack damage multiplier to targets that are ravaged is then what like puts her over the 3-star partner, right? And then here, when an ally inflicts ravage, 1 overclock to the combatant, for 1 turn you get 25% crit chance for a turn, so you get a crit chance boost. On the other hand, as we said, we have ourselves Yuri, where you get the 16% attack increase, then the 16% upon you shuffling for the first time, but you see there is no like extra damage against ravaged targets, but you have to give it to her. The drone deployment draw 2 is one of the most powerful ego skills in the entire game right now, and that's again why I would rate the dedicated partner only slightly, maybe like 5 to 10% higher than the 3-star partner. So it's going to go dedicated partner, then Yuri, and then on the other hand, what other options do you have? Janet doesn't really work because she's talking about bullet cards, and also the crit chance for the 1-cost cards, which would still be fine. Sereniel herself gives you crit chance, gives you crit damage, but the 2 vulnerability from her ego skill really doesn't end up being that great. So Sereniel being the battle pass partner right here. The ego skill itself, only 2 vulnerability, which mostly favors big hits rather than smaller ones, or multiple ones. So then the only remaining ones are going to be a card who only boosts bullet damage, so he falls flat for Sereniel. Then Kiara, which is Renoa's dedicated partner, relies on massive accumulation in the graveyard and also a rather weak ego skill. I also wouldn't recommend Kiara, giving us only Carity to have a look at, where Carity deals at the start of the turn 1 attack cards gets a 20% multiplier, and when you generate an attack card for the first time, attack card damage increases by 20, whereas for 1 turn the damage of cards get generated by the assigned combatants increases by 20. So overall you're going to have a most of the time weaker passive than you just get when you were to equip a Yuri on Carity. So the order again, dedicated partner, then Yuri, then Serethea, and then Carity. That's most likely how it will go. So overall, that is kind of the order, leaving the question of, is it still worth it, right? All things considered, if you had to pick between summoning for the partner and summoning for Sereniel, you obviously want to get one Sereniel copy, right? You want to get one Sereniel copy if you can really only afford one, but if you can afford two, you do want to get both the Sereniel copy and a Peku copy, because both of them are limited. Now, if for example, you can only afford, let's say 2, but you also have this shop currency right here, in general, the smartest thing you can do should be to buy a copy for Sereniel with 400 instead of buying the partner, and that is just due to RNG, with the partner being guaranteed after 70, whereas right here you can go upwards of 120 to 140 to guarantee yourself a additional Sereniel. Alright, so now let's get to the important part. Chizuru, right? If you don't yet have a Chizuru and you have a limited amount of summons, do not go for Chizuru, try going for Sereniel. Sereniel is someone you can only get for the next 3 weeks. Chizuru is always someone who can spook you off her own banner, right? Like offer as an off banner, Chizuru can always be the character you get. Like for example, you could be pulling for Sereniel, you fail the 50-50 and you could still get a Chizuru. That is absolutely something that could happen to you. And you could always at any point with the given standard summons that you get through various events and the like, always be able to get her like that. So it's just the availability, right? The availability of Chizuru is that much higher. Now, the same is also true for Chizuru Egos. Chizuru Egos herself, if you are thinking, okay, Chizuru Ego or one copy of Sereniel, always go with the copy for the new character. It is always better to have a character rather than an ego for an already existing character, no matter what, just because it opens up more teams, gives you more playtime, gives you more value, things you can do. On the another note, also, if you have this Omega code right here, do hold on to it. Do not use it for Chizuru. You can use it for Sereniel, and it just seems like the meta way of using these Omega codes going forward is just going to be on these limited characters, because they are just more valuable on those, because you can use this Omega code, for example, even if Sereniel's banner does end. But then regardless, let's quickly go over the epiphanies and or egos. Let me give you a bit of a rundown of how valuable I think these are. This is honestly quite nice, quite straightforward, and will also be quite sweet if you want to run a Sereniel Chizuru combo where Chizuru is going to be your only healer. So for example, Kalib, Chizuru, Sereniel, you could then get yourself the Shadow of the Moons, and then you would get a 8% instead of a 5% heal, and all those hits would most likely be generated and come from Sereniel herself. That's already where kind of this first synergy comes from. Just a lot of damn hits, which builds a lot of these Will-O-Wisp stacks, which allows you to get a lot of Shadow of the Moons. Now then, the E2 here, when Shadow of the Moon Plus is used, create one Shadow of the Moon card. Once again, kind of as well ties in beautifully with the Shadow of the Moon Plus and the E1, and that is, if you use it at 3 stacks, you're going to get 1 stack back, meaning that you only then need to get 2 more stacks to get your next heal out. So overall, gives her even more of that healing, but also don't forget, she's still not a healer, she is still also a damage dealer. You're going to get all that damage from that Shadow of the Moon bind 3, especially if you have yourself with the bound card. The E3 is unimportant. The E4 is definitely the stepping point for a Chizuru, giving you, depending on how many Shadow of the Moons you create, up to 30% permanent damage bonus for the fight. The E5 is whatever, and the E6 itself is a little sad in you only get 1 hit. So if you play the multi-hit build, this is irrelevant. If you don't play the multi-hit build, even then, it's not that great, right? It's not that great. The E6 really isn't that important for Chizuru. So that's kind of like this, ego manifestation overview if you want. And then I've already mentioned it briefly, but that is truly the biggest connection between Chizuru and Sereniel, and that is cannot gain AP except at the start of the turn or on Ravage. At the moment, it just wasn't realistic. It really wasn't realistic for any character to reliably ravage the targets every single turn to actually get that guaranteed AP gen. You maybe had to like every 2 turns, maybe every 3, maybe every 4, maybe never, right? Which is why this last part really wasn't that important. But now that you have a character who's entirely focused on Ravage, you can then use the value of Bound at Dusk. The whole point of Bound at Dusk is that activating 2 other cards for free, reducing 2 different cards by 1, or reducing 1 card by 2 is incredibly strong. Doing that for every single turn is at minimum in this example, and this card basically says you can play 5 AP every turn instead of just 3, and where this one, depending on which card it plays, has even more of that value. And that's the whole reason why Inhibit exists, not necessarily to boost a hit to Shadow of the Moon, but to give a bit of a drawback to one of the strongest cards in the entire game being Bound at Dusk, right? Being Bound at Dusk and then having the ability to ravage targets, work around that, get even more AP. It's just a pretty straightforward way. It is already, it's out there, right? The devs do intend for you to use both Chizuru and Sereniel together in Chaosis to probably just annihilate stuff. You can then just get a 3rd unit in. The crazy part is we still don't even know all the epiphanies of Sereniel, and we already know she is just already going to be good. She is at minimum going to be good. Sky is the limit. We'll have to see if she has like infinite scaling cards or anything crazy like that to really compete with those Maylins and potentially Luke's or Cassius's, or even Tressa's if you want to. So yeah, we'll just have to see how that goes. But yeah, overall, Sereniel, Chizuru together, it's going to be a nasty, nasty ride. So now that we talked about all these partners, that we talked about Chizuru a bit more in detail, let's just end it on a more Sereniel focused note. If you're looking forward to tomorrow, as probably most of you are, how far should you take Sereniel? What's the best point to stop at? Obviously, the very best, the safest point to stop with Chizuru is going to be E0. Not Chizuru, Sereniel, right? If you stop at E0 Sereniel, you have all the time, you have the whole 3 weeks to see what other people can come up with, maybe see some leaderboards, maybe check some clips, check some rankings, or just do some testing yourself to see, okay, how much do you like her at E0? I would at minimum recommend getting 1 Chizuru, not getting Sereniel, 1 Sereniel, not getting 1 Sereniel. It's just, you don't want to do that because the devs already said she can come back at some point, which could mean it's in a year, next Christmas, could also mean 2 years. It's just not worth the risk not getting the unit, especially if, for example, a team, even if in 4 months a team comes out that uses her, or a unit comes out that perfectly works with her and you don't have her, you're going to feel a little bad about it. And that's the whole point of limited units, I guess. But yeah, now that you know that E0 is obviously the best point, E0 already makes her a really strong unit. what are the benefits and what would be the stopping points, in my opinion, for these ego manifestations. So the E1 herself gives her, her purple card a damage increase of 25% from 150 to 200, and it allows you to activate up to 5 homing lasers in your draw pile or graveyard. Only drawback here would be you don't have 5 homing lasers, meaning you would never be able to activate them, but that just depends on the fight and how many cards you play and certain factors like that. But overall, it is definitely above average and in the top half of what E1s can do in the game. E1s generally tend to be good. This one is good as well. And for example, it's not like Yuki where it removes the debuff of a purple card. No, it just makes the purple card even better. Kind of reminiscent of how Keiron summons 5 futilities instead of 3. Now she activates 5 instead of 3 homing lasers. So then that is the E1. E1 is just good, right? Getting 1 E1 or even just using your Omega code to get the E1, it's just good, it's sweet, but it's nothing too crazy. Now what this does is at the start of the battle you create 2 of these homing lasers that are mentioned in here. And that means that especially in a chaos run where you run into multiple fights, you start multiple battles, that is quite powerful. Because it's 2 zero cost cards, meaning you'll always have a very strong turn 1, right? Already, you could say quality of life. Furthermore, then you get these homing lasers that you can then not only recall with the pale shooting star, or obviously better said with the upgraded pale shooting star, but you can then also recall with your ego skill right here to move them into the hand. So it just gets her engine going faster. But then now the bigger one, on turn draw, if one of those cards is a homing laser, draw 1 card. What that says is if you start your turn and draw a homing laser in your turn start, get 1 additional card. So plus 1 card on draw of homing laser. And one of the reasons why I would say this is there is because you're going to end up creating a bunch of homing lasers that will also go into your graveyard, meaning at some point they go back into your deck. You either exhaust or activate them before, but they could also get into your hand. And then if you draw this card, it's a bit of a dead card. It's not really a dead card. It works with your kit, it does its ability, it costs you nothing, but that's it, right? You then play the card and then technically you only drew 4 cards. But with this, you then also get an additional draw, meaning additional value, overall making E2 just feel good plus engine start boost is kind of how I guess I would describe it. And this is probably the most comfortable, maybe even the most realistic point for most players to stop at, and that is E2 and no further, or even E0 and use the next 2 seasons Omega codes to get the E2, or E1 and use the Omega code to get to E2, any combination like that. Whereas then for the E3 you get 50% damage and you apply haste to each homing laser. So what that means is you'll get yourself a bunch of homing lasers in your hand and then you can play them all out without having to worry for the enemy action count to go down. But then again, Sereniel herself is a unit that already plays a damn lot of cards, meaning most likely the enemy will have moved anyway. It's good, but it's not great. It's not super necessary, and there will be ways for you to play around this, like for example by just using rallies to increase enemy action count, or just using Wanderer of the Void to stop enemy action countdown completely. So that's why kind of like E2 is good, because not only would you need to go to through the E3, you would then have to pull another unit to then get what I would consider the final stopping point for Sereniel, unless you're obviously a true Sereniel enjoyer and you want to, like, I don't know, worship that lobby screen a bit. And that is Sereniel gains a boost for each homing laser that is moved to hand on ravaging, which is for your turn. So that means if, for example, you play out 3 homing lasers onto the target, they all go into the graveyard, you then ravage that target, these 3 will come back, meaning that for this burst window, this phase where the target is ravaged, you get an additional plus 30% damage to all of her attack cards, which then goes on top of the plus 50% damage you get from the set, on top of the plus 50% damage you get from her Afterglow buff, and on top of the plus 15% multiplicative that you get from her partner. So yeah, overall just even more focus on that ravage, big burst window during the enemy being ravaged, right? And this is like the biggest damage boost to her. The E5 is a bit of a waste in that it only gives you 6% to the basics, to the uniques, so the epiphanyable cards and the purple card obviously, or then to cards that come from the outside in, like for example, let's see, what would be a relevant card you'd put on her? I don't know, honestly, like any maybe monster card, right? And then lastly, Liberated Memory. When an ally inflicts Ravage, Sereniel inflicts 80% damage for each segment of the Ravage Tenacity max Ravage Tenacity bar to the enemy. So if, for example, you break a unit and that unit has a bar of 5, Sereniel is going to do 400% damage. It's sweet, it's okay, but by no means is it something that you have to chase. So the best stopping points are, again, E0, E1, E2, or E4. That's kind of really what you want to be working for. And then for the rest of the kit, before we discuss any of these cards further, we obviously have to see the full kit, which you can watch me do that live tomorrow. We're going to be again live around 30 minutes before the patch starts, just to like get a bit going and the like. And we'll do again extensive testing on Sereniel with a guide / summary at the end as you're used to. Peace!